The morning Roscoe Hudson found a woman standing at the edge of his dead land with a cloth sack pressed against her chest like it held something sacred. He almost turned his horse around and rode back to town without a word. He did not turn around. That was the thing about Roscoe. He never did what would have been easier. The year was 1878, and the territory of Colorado had been breathing dust for 3 seasons straight. The drought had cracked the earth into patterns that reminded old-timers of Bible illustrations, the kind that showed the land of plagues, the kind that made a man feel small and guilty just for standing on it. Pueblo sat 30 miles north, and the little community of Crest Hollow where Roscoe had his spread was the kind of place that barely made it onto survey maps. 17 families, one general store run by a man named Earl Giddings who watered down his whiskey, and nobody said anything, because he was also the postmaster. A livery, a church that doubled as a school, and a lot of red earth baking under a sun that seemed personally offended by the idea of clouds. Roscoe's land was 240 acres of that same red earth. He had a house on it that he kept clean, because his mother had raised him to keep things clean, even when there was no reason to anymore. He had a barn, a good well that had not gone dry, 3 horses, 11 cattle, and a dog named Governor who was 15 years old and mostly slept. He had fences he mended out of habit more than necessity, because there was nothing growing inside them worth protecting. He had not planted anything for himself in 6 years. He planted for other people. That was how he made his living now. He worked the alderman spread in the spring, the Holt property in the summer, and in the fall he helped Earl Giddings with his small vegetable plot out back of the store. He knew soil the way a doctor knew bones. He could look at a handful of dirt and tell you what it was missing, what it had too much of, what it needed to be coaxed back to life. He did this for everyone else's land, and he came home to his own and let it sit there empty. People in Crest Hollow understood, or thought they did. They knew about Clara. They knew about the baby that came too early and the fever that followed, and the way that house had gone quiet in the spring of 1872 when Roscoe was 27 years old. They knew he had taken down the curtains Clara had sewn and folded them carefully in a cedar chest. They knew he had turned the earth over after she died, turned it over and over like he was trying to bury something, and then one day he had just stopped. Nobody pushed him. That was the good thing about small communities in the West. They had their gossip and their judgments, but they also had a deep understanding of grief, because grief was everywhere out here. It was in the bones of the land itself. So Roscoe existed. He worked hard for other people. He rode into town on Saturdays, bought his supplies, exchanged necessary words with Earl Giddings and Pastor Whitmore and the alderman boys, and he rode home. He was 33 years old, and he looked like a man who had decided that existing was enough. That was the morning he saw Mary Wallace. She was standing at the post-andrail fence that marked the southern boundary of his property, the one that bordered the old county road that almost nobody used anymore since the main trail had shifted west. She was not a tall woman, but she stood like she was. Her hair was dark, almost black, and she wore it pinned up under a sun-bleached bonnet that had clearly seen better decades. Her dress was brown calico, practical, the kind of thing a woman wore when she was not trying to make an impression, but ended up making one anyway. She had a cloth sack in her arms, and she was looking at his land with the particular expression of someone who understood what they were looking at, not pity. That was the first thing Roscoe clocked about her. There was no pity in her face. There was something more like recognition. He slowed his horse, a bay gelding named Patch, and came up alongside the fence. She looked up at him without startling, which told him she had heard him coming from a ways back and had simply chosen not to react. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. "You would be Roscoe Hudson. I would be. I am Mary Wallace. I have taken the Breckenridge place, the one at the end of Sycamore Fork Road." He knew the Breckenridge place. Hiram Breckenridge had died 2 winters ago and left his property to a nephew in St. Louis who had no interest in it and had been trying to sell it for a year and a half. It was 40 acres, good water access, a house that needed work but had good bones. He nodded slowly. I did not know someone had bought it, he said. I did not buy it, she said, and there was something careful in the way she said it, careful but not ashamed. I have been renting from Mr. Carlyle in Pueblo. He manages the property now. The nephew gave it over to him. Renting is a good start, Roscoe said, because he was not a man who said unnecessary things, but he was also not a man who left a woman's statement hanging in silence like a verdict. She looked back at his land. The morning light was lying flat across it, golden and revealing, the way it did in that hour before the sun climbed high enough to become brutal. It showed the emptiness clearly. The fence lines enclosing nothing but cracked earth and the stubborn wire grass that nobody planted and nobody wanted. I came to ask a favor, she said, looking back at him. I have more seeds than I know what to do with. I bought too many in Pueblo before I came out here, and I hate to see them go to waste. I was wondering if you might want them. Roscoe looked at the sack in her arms. He was a man who understood soil and seeds the way some men understood horses or cards. He could see the weight and shape of that sack. He could make some educated guesses about what was inside it based on the slight angular shapes pressing through the cloth. And he was 33 years old and had been alive long enough to know when a thing that was being offered as an afterthought was not an afterthought at all. Those seeds had not been purchased extra. She had bought them for this. She had bought them for him specifically, for this empty land, and she was standing there with a story about excess inventory because she had figured, probably correctly, that a man like Roscoe Hudson would not accept charity from a woman he had never met and had no reason to take pity from. He sat on Patch for a long moment. The horse swished his tail at a horsefly. Governor, who had somehow materialized beside the fence, sat down and looked up at Mary Wallace with the calm approval of a very old dog who had excellent judgment. "What kind of seeds?" Roscoe said. "Corn," she said. "Some winter squash, beans the climbing kind. And I have some sunflower seeds which I know are not strictly practical, but I find them cheerful." He almost smiled. He did not quite. "That is a lot of extra seeds," he said. "I told you I bought too many." He held her gaze for a moment, and she held his right back steady as a post. She was not going to crack. She was going to stand there and hold to her story and let him decide what to do with it. "I suppose I could take them off your hands," he said. The relief that crossed her face was brief, almost invisible, but he caught it. She handed the sack up to him over the fence railing, and he took it, and her fingers were warm where they brushed his as the sack changed hands, and that small detail lodged itself somewhere in his chest and stayed there. "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate it. I will be by Tuesday to check on the Breckenridge property," he said, which was not something he had planned to say and was not strictly true. "The well on that land can get cantankerous in dry spells, just to let you know." She looked at him with those steady eyes. "I would appreciate that." She walked back toward the road, where a brown mule waited patiently beside a wagon that was packed with the organized deliberateness of someone who had moved before, who knew exactly how to load everything so nothing broke and everything fit. He watched her climb up onto the seat and click the mule into motion without looking back. He looked down at the sack in his hands. He sat there on Patch for a long time after the wagon disappeared around the bend, and the morning light shifted and the air started to heat up. And eventually Governor leaned against the horse's leg and sighed the way old dogs sigh when they have been patient enough, and it is time to go home. Roscoe rode back to his barn and hung his hat on the peg and set the seed sack on the workbench. He stood looking at it. He picked it up and opened it slowly, the way you open something you are not entirely sure you want to find. The corn seeds were good, fat and dry and properly cured. The bean seeds were excellent, a variety he recognized from the hill country of Texas, hard to find this far north. The squash seeds were small and pale. The sunflower seeds smelled like summer. He closed the sack and stood very still for a long moment. Then he walked out to the shed and got his breaking plow. He spent 3 days turning over the south field. It was brutal work even with Patch pulling the plow, because the earth had been left unworked for so long, and the drought had hardened the upper crust to something close to clay. His shoulders ached on the first night and screamed on the second, and on the third day he had a rhythm going and the land was opening up around him like it had been waiting, like it had been sitting there all those years, not barren but patient, holding its breath. He did not let himself think about why he was doing it. He just worked. He went to check on the Breckenridge property on Tuesday, as he had said. The house was in better shape than he expected. She had been there less than 2 weeks and already the front porch had been repaired, new boards replacing the rotted ones, and someone had patched the window on the north side of the house with good glass, not the oilskin or wood that most people used as a stopgap. He tied Patch to the fence post and walked up to the door and knocked. She answered quickly, which meant she had heard him coming, which he was already learning was a habit of hers. "Mr. Hudson," she said. "The well," he said, because he needed a reason to be there and the well was his reason. She stepped back and let him in. The inside of the house was clean and spare, the way his own house was, but there were small things in it that made it feel lived in rather than just occupied. A jar of dried wildflowers on the table, a quilt on the chair by the window, blues and yellows worn soft, a cast-iron pot on the stove that smelled like onions and sage, and something that made his stomach remind him he had only eaten jerky and coffee since dawn. "The well is out back," she said. He went out back and checked the well. It was fine. The rope was new and the bucket was sound, and the water came up clear and cold when he drew it. He stood there looking at it for a moment longer than was necessary. She came out and stood beside him. "It seems fine," she said. "It is fine now," he said. "But I meant what I said about dry spells. You will want to watch it." "I will watch it," she said. There was a pause. "Would you like to stay for supper?" He should have said no. He said yes. They ate at the small table by the window, and the light came through in long, warm bars, and Governor, who had followed at a distance and was now lying outside the door, made small, snuffling sounds in his sleep. Mary made a stew that was better than anything Roscoe had eaten in longer than he wanted to count, and she made biscuits that were light enough to float. She was from Missouri, she told him. Joplin originally. She had been married once briefly to a man named Thomas Wallace who had come west ahead of her to scout land and had died of typhoid fever before she arrived. She had come out anyway because she had already sold everything she had and there was nothing to go back to. She said this with the same steadiness she applied to everything, not bitterly, not sadly, just as fact, the way you might describe weather. "How long have you been in Colorado?" he asked. 3 years, she said. "I was in Pueblo most of that time, working in the household of a family named Garrett. Good people, but I wanted land. I have always wanted land." "This land is good," he said, meaning it. "The Breckenridge soil is better than it looks." "I know," she said. "I tested it before I signed the rental agreement, pushed my hand down in 3 places to feel it." He looked at her across the table. "You tested the soil," he said. "I grew up farming," she said simply. "You learn to test before you commit." Something shifted in the air between them, some small recognition, the way it is when you discover someone speaks the same language as you in a place where you thought you were alone. He looked at her hands around her coffee cup and saw the same calluses he had on his own, the same kind that came from a life of working ground. "I am planting the south field," he said, which was not something he had intended to say. She did not make a fuss about it. She just said, "The seeds should go in soon if you want the corn up before first frost." "I know," he said. "I know you know," she said, and she smiled for the first time, a small particular smile that managed to be both warm and wry at once, and it hit him somewhere between the sternum and the spine. He rode home in the blue dusk with Governor trotting alongside, and the stars were coming out over the mesa, sharp and plentiful the way they were out here where there were no town lights to compete with them, and he felt something he had not felt in so long he had almost forgotten it had a name. Hopeful. He felt hopeful. He planted the south field the following week. He went methodically, row by row, measuring with the easy expertise of someone who had done this 1,000 times, and the corn went in first. Then the beans in the neighboring rows where they could climb the corn stalks as they grew. The squash went at the edges where it could spread. The sunflowers he planted along the fence line facing east because they were happiest facing the morning. He worked alone. That was fine. He had always worked alone. But there was something different about the working now, something that made him want to do it right in a way that went beyond habit or professionalism. He found himself thinking about the color of Mary Wallace's eyes, which were dark brown with a quality of light in them that reminded him of creek water in autumn. He found himself thinking about the way she tested soil before committing. He thought, a woman who tests soil before she commits does not make mistakes easily. A woman like that takes her time and means what she says. He was not sure what to do with that thought, so he just planted seeds and let it sit there alongside them. The following Saturday he saw her at Giddings' store. She was buying flour and lamp oil and a length of calico, and Earl Giddings was talking at her the way he talked at everyone, the steady drone of a man who had too much to say and not enough audience. She was being polite about it with the efficient politeness of someone who has had practice extracting herself from long conversations. He came in and her eyes found him immediately, and the relief in them was genuine. "Mr. Hudson," she said, in a tone that clearly meant please come over here and give me a reason to stop listening to this man. "Miss Wallace," he said, and came to stand at the counter. Earl Giddings, who was not actually a bad man but was an exhausting one, was delighted to have another audience member and launched into a story about a supply wagon from Denver that had been delayed by a washed-out bridge. Roscoe listened with half his attention and used the other half to be aware of Mary Wallace standing 3 feet to his left, aware of her in a way that was new and slightly alarming and not entirely unpleasant. When they finally escaped the store, they stood outside in the main dust of the single street, and she exhaled with feeling. "That man could talk a fence post into moving," she said. Roscoe felt that thing again, the almost smile. This time it broke fully through. He was briefly surprised by it, the way you are surprised by something you have not done in a while, the muscles remembering before the mind does. She was looking at him with an expression that was pleased and a little surprised, and he understood that she had not seen him smile before. "Your corn is probably up by now," she said. "Broke ground day before yesterday," he said. "Mine is a week ahead of yours," she said, without any particular smugness, just reporting. "I know," he said. "You went in earlier. You were right to, given the weather pattern this spring." She tilted her head. "You have been watching my field. Your property borders the county road I used to get to the Alderman spread," he said. "It is hard not to notice." She accepted this with a small nod that suggested she was not entirely sure she believed it but was not going to press it. "You could come see it properly," she said, "if you want. I have some questions about the north corner where the soil changes. I am not sure what I am dealing with." "Thursday," he said. "Thursday," she agreed. Thursday became a standing thing, though neither of them formalized it exactly. He came on Thursday, and they walked her land and talked about soil and irrigation and what the sky was doing, and they drank coffee on her porch and talked about other things too, quieter things, the kind of things that take a little time to build toward. He told her about his father, who had come out from Virginia with nothing but a mule and a determination that had seemed like stubbornness until it started working. She told him about her mother, who had been the best gardener in Jasper County and who had died of a fever when Mary was 12, and how she had learned everything about growing things partly from her mother's example and partly from sheer stubbornness, because she missed her and plants were a way of holding onto something. He understood that exactly. He did not say so, but she seemed to see it in him anyway. It was the last Thursday of May, with the corn standing 4 inches high in his south field and doing the same in hers, when he told her about Clara. He was not sure why he told her. They were sitting on her porch in the early evening, and the swallows were doing their acrobatics above the barn, and Governor was asleep in a patch of last light on the porch boards, and she had asked something simple, something about whether he had always been in Colorado, And the answer to that question led through Missouri, and it led through 1872, and he just let it lead. He told her about meeting Clara Marsh at a church social in the Missouri town of his youth, how she had laughed at something. He said that he had not even meant to be funny, and how that laugh had been the end of him. How they had come west together in 1869, newly married, full of that particular young courage that looks a lot like not knowing what could go wrong. How they had built the house on the Crest Hollow land together, literally together, her handing him nails and arguing about where the windows should go. How the years had been hard and good in the uneven way that life in the territory always was. How the baby had come early in February of 1872, a boy they had named William, who had lived 3 days. How Clara had developed a fever that the doc from Pueblo could not get ahead of. How she had died on a Tuesday morning in March with the early spring light coming through the bedroom window and Roscoe sitting beside her holding her hand and not being able to do a single thing. He told it quietly, without drama, looking out at the field. Mary did not say anything while he talked, did not make soft noises of condolence, did not reach over and pat his hand. She just listened fully, the way some people can listen when they have been properly devastated themselves and know that what another person needs is not comfort exactly but witness. When he finished there was a long quiet. "I am sorry about William," she said then, "and about Clara." "Thank you," he said. "The land," she said carefully, "the south field, you had not planted it since then." "No." She was quiet for another moment. "I want you to know something," she said, "and I hope you will take it the way I mean it. Those seeds were not extra." He had known. He had known from the moment she handed that sack over the fence. But hearing her say it, her voice steady and her eyes on the middle distance where the last of the sun was going out over the mesa, did something to him that knowing had not done. "I figured that," he said. "I saw your land when I came through on the road my first week here," she said. "I saw the fence lines and the empty fields, and I asked Earl Giddings about it. He told me about your wife." She turned to look at him. "I did not buy those seeds out of pity, Mr. Hudson. I want to be clear about that. I bought them because I have been on land where nothing is growing and I know what it does to a person, and I thought maybe the person who needed planting again was not the field." The swallows dove and wheeled. Governor stirred in his sleep and settled again. "You were right about that," Roscoe said, and his voice came out a little rougher than he intended. "I usually am," she said, and the small wry smile was back, and it was the most beautiful thing he had seen in 6 years. He was quiet for a moment. "Can I ask you something, Miss Wallace?" "Mary," she said, "I think we are past Miss Wallace." "Mary," he said, and her name in his mouth felt like the first word of something. "Why did you come to this particular piece of country? There are 40-acre properties all over Colorado territory." She looked out at her field, at the neat rows of young corn catching the last light. "I wanted to be somewhere that needed something," she said. "I have found that I do better when I am useful, when there is work that matters." She paused. "And Mr. Carlyle offered me a good rate." He recognized the second part of that answer as the same kind of cover story she had given him about the seeds, a practical reason laid over a deeper one. He did not push it. He tucked it away the same way he had tucked away her warm fingers on the fence post. "Roscoe," he said, "if we are past Miss Wallace." She looked at him. "Roscoe," she said. They sat in the cooling dark for another 20 minutes talking about nothing in particular, about the Alderman family's new bull and the strange rock formation on the East Ridge, and whether Earl Giddings had ever in his life sold a pound of coffee that was actually as dark as he claimed. And the easy warmth of it, the simplicity of just being in someone's company without it costing anything, was something Roscoe had forgotten was possible. He rode home under a sky thick with stars and felt wide awake in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. June came in hot and demanding, and the corn grew with the desperate urgency of things that know they have a short season. Roscoe was busy, working his own field in the morning and the alderman spread in the afternoon, and on Thursdays he still went to Mary's place, but they started working alongside each other rather than just talking, because there was always work to be done, and because they were both the kind of people who were more themselves when their hands were occupied. They built a proper trellis for her climbing beans together, a Saturday in mid-June, with the sun beating down and their shirt sleeves rolled up and Governor supervising from a cool patch of shade by the barn door. Roscoe drove the posts and Mary strung the twine, and they argued pleasantly about the proper tension, which was the kind of argument that is not really an argument at all. "It should be tighter," she said. "Tighter, and the vine will cut itself on it when the wind comes up," he said. "I know how to string a trellis," she said. "I know you do," he said. "I am just pointing out the consequences of the choices." She pulled a face at him that was so unexpectedly undignified it surprised a genuine laugh out of him, the kind that comes from the belly, the kind he had not had in so long it felt almost foreign. She stopped and looked at him with a pleasure in her eyes that she did not try to hide. "There it is," she said softly. "What?" "I had a feeling you had a laugh in there somewhere," she said. "I have been patient." He shook his head, smiling. "Tighten the twine," he said. "You will see I am right when the wind comes." "We will see who is right when the wind comes," she said, and tightened the twine. The wind came the following week, and she lost 3 feet of the trellis on the north end. He repaired it on a Thursday and did not say a single word about it. She watched him work, and he could feel her watching, and eventually she said, "You may have had a small point about the tension." "I was going to let that go unmentioned," he said. "No, you were not," she said. "No," he agreed, "I was not." They were friends. They were becoming something else, something that had no name yet but had a shape, a warmth, a particular gravity that kept pulling them toward each other in the way that land-based people are pulled toward water. It was not the explosive kind of falling in love, not the breathless, instantaneous variety of the dime novels. It was the slow kind, the kind that builds through work and weather and conversation, through learning the particular way a person drinks their coffee, and the particular way they stand when they are thinking hard, and the particular way their face changes when they hear something that moves them. He was learning all of these things about Mary Wallace, and they were making a home in him, which was something he had not expected anything to do again. The trouble started in July. It started with a man named Dale Prentice. Prentice was not from Crest Hollow. He was from the larger town of Hargrove, 20 miles east, where he operated a land and loan business that had made him wealthy and had not made him pleasant. He was in his mid-40s, heavy-set and deliberate, the kind of man who moved slowly because he was confident things would wait for him. He had come through Crest Hollow twice in the past year on business with the Alderman family, buying up a portion of their land at a price Roscoe thought was unfair, but that was not his business to say. On a Monday morning in early July, Prentice appeared at Mary's property. Roscoe knew about it because he was coming down the county road that morning on his way to town, and he saw Prentice's buggy, a nice glossy black one that was conspicuous out here in the dust, pulled up at Mary's fence. He saw Prentice standing at the fence speaking to Mary, who was standing on her side with her arms crossed. He pulled Patch up and watched for a moment. The body language of the conversation was clear. Mary's arms were crossed. Prentice was doing all the talking. He rode in. Prentice turned when he heard the horse. He had a broad red face and small eyes, and a hat that cost more than most people's saddles. "Hudson," he said, with the tone of a man who considers acknowledging someone else's existence a kind of generosity. "Prentice," Roscoe said, stopping Patch at the fence and looking at Mary. "Everything all right? Mr. Prentice was just explaining to me that he has an offer for the Breckenridge property," Mary said. Her voice was composed, but her eyes were not. Prentice turned back to her with the patience of a man who intends to outlast you. "As I was saying, the rental arrangement you have through Carlisle is not particularly favorable to you, Miss Wallace. I can buy the property and offer you a very fair price for your improvements, and she is renting, not selling," Roscoe said. Prentice glanced at him. "I was speaking to the lady." "And the lady was not speaking in a way that suggested she was interested," Roscoe said. You are on a public road and she is on her property. If she has said what she needs to say, the conversation is finished." There was a pause that was quite tight with everything unspoken in it. Prentice looked at Mary. Mary looked at Prentice with eyes that had gone very still. "I am not interested, Mr. Prentice," she said clearly. "This land is not for sale and I am not leaving it." Prentice put his hat back on his head in a deliberate way. "Offer stands if you change your mind," he said, to her rather than to Roscoe, making the point of it. He walked back to his buggy and drove away. Roscoe looked at Mary. "He has been before?" he asked. She unfolded her arms. 3 weeks ago. He had another approach then, more polite. She looked down the road at the diminishing dust. "He wants this land specifically because the new water rights survey shows a creek line running through the north corner. Having water rights out here is worth real money." Roscoe knew about the survey. He had heard about it from the alderman boys who had their own concerns about it. "He does not have a legal claim to it," he said. "He does not need a legal claim," she said. "He needs me to leave. If I leave, the rental lapses and the nephew innocent. Louis will sell and Prentice will buy." She looked back at her field at the corn standing tall and green in the July sun. "I am not leaving." "Good," he said. She looked at him. "I mean it," he said. "This land is right for you and you are right for it. Do not let Prentice push you out." Something softened in her face briefly before she got it back under control. "I was not planning to," she said, "but I appreciate you saying so." "I meant that you should not let him corner you alone again," he said. "Not out of concern that you cannot handle him. You clearly can. But men like Prentice are the kind who are polite in company and not polite out of it. You understand me." She understood him. The look in her eyes said so plainly. "I am not unfamiliar with that kind of man," she said quietly, and there was something behind that statement that he did not push on, but he heard it. He rode into town and had a quiet word with Earl Giddings and another with Pastor Whitmore. Not threatening, not dramatic, just the kind of word that let the community know that Mary Wallace was a person worth looking out for. Crest Hollow was small enough that this mattered. Information traveled like water here, finding every low place. Prentice came back a third time in late July. This time there were 2 men with him, big men whose job was clearly decorative, meant to suggest a crowd. He caught Mary at her well and made his offer again, this time with numbers attached, and this time with a tone that was less polite than the previous ones. He did not know that Roscoe had taken to riding the county road past her property twice a day, morning and evening, as a regular part of his route. And he did not see Roscoe coming down the road at a canter until he was already at the fence. What happened in the next 20 minutes was not violent, technically. There were no guns drawn. No one was hurt. But Roscoe dismounted and came to stand at the fence beside Mary, and he spoke to Dale Prentice in a voice that was very quiet and very clear. And what he said included a specific and detailed accounting of what water rights actually meant legally under territorial law, which he happened to know because he had ridden to Pueblo and spoken to a solicitor 2 weeks prior for exactly this reason. He also mentioned, in the same quiet tone, that he had written a letter to the Territorial Land Office outlining the situation, and that this letter was currently in the possession of Earl Giddings, who was the postmaster and who would be sending it at the end of the week unless there was no longer any reason to send it. This was a bluff in one part and not a bluff in the other. The letter was real. The solicitor consultation was real. The bluff was that the Territorial Land Office would act on it particularly quickly. But men like Prentice depended on people not knowing their rights, on people being uncertain about the law, and Roscoe had made himself certain. Prentice left. He came back one more time in August alone, and Mary met him at the fence herself and told him in the same clear, direct way she had the first time that she was not leaving, that she had legal consultation on her side, and that she wished him a good afternoon. He left and he did not come back. The corn was shoulder-high by then and showing its silk. The beans had covered the trellis in a cascade of green, and the squash had spread enormously, great sprawling leaves that held the dew in the early morning and shone in the sunrise. The sunflowers along the fence line were open and blazing gold, turned east toward the morning, and Roscoe's south field looked like something out of a description of the promised land rather than the baked red earth it had been in March. He stood at the edge of it one evening in August with Mary beside him, she having come over to bring back a shovel she had borrowed, and they looked at it together in the declining light. "You did a good thing," she said. "The land did most of it," he said. "You turned it over," she said. "You put the seeds in. The land does not do that for itself." She glanced at him. "Neither do people." He was quiet for a moment. The evening breeze came through the corn with a papery rustling sound, the particular sound of a healthy field in summer, and he had not heard that sound from his own land in 6 years, and it sat inside him like a chord finally resolved. "I have been thinking about something," he said, looking straight ahead. "Tell me," she said. "The Breckenridge rental," he said. "It is 40 acres and it will support you, but it is not yours. Prentice is a problem that has quieted, but it will not stay quiet forever, because the water survey is real, and the money is real, and men like Prentice are patient." "I know that," she said. "The parcel on my east side," he said, "the 40 acres that runs from the creek line to the ridge. It is mine outright, bought and paid for, and it has been sitting fallow because I have more land than I have been using. I have been thinking about whether," he started again. "I am not a man who says things carelessly, Mary. I want you to understand that before I finish this sentence." She turned to look at him fully. The last light was in her hair and on her face, and she was very still in the way she was still when she was listening with her whole self. "I have been thinking about whether you would consider moving your operation to my east parcel," he said, "under terms that are fair to you and that give you actual ownership over time, not rental, ownership." He paused. "I have also been thinking about considerably more than that, but I wanted to start there because it is the part that makes the most practical sense to say first." She looked at him for a long time. "The considerably more than that," she said carefully. "Are you about to say what I think you are about to say?" "Probably," he said. "Then say it properly," she said. "You are a man who says things deliberately. Say the thing deliberately." He turned to face her. He was not a man who made speeches, and he did not make one now. He just looked at her and said what was true. "I have been falling in love with you since the morning you stood at my fence with a sack of seeds you told me were extra," he said. "I know what that costs to say, and I am saying it anyway. I am 33 years old, and I thought I was finished with this particular kind of hoping, and you have proven me completely wrong about that, and I am grateful." He took a breath. "I would like to know if you feel anything that resembles what I am feeling, because if you do, I would like the chance to court you properly and see where it goes. And if you do not, I would like to still be your neighbor and your friend and help you deal with Prentice if he comes back, because that part is not contingent on the other." She was quiet for what felt like a long time and was probably 30 seconds. "Roscoe Hudson," she said, and her voice had changed. The careful, composed quality of it had shifted, and underneath it was something warm and unguarded that he had been hoping was there. "I drove a mule from Pueblo to Crest Hollow in April, past 17 properties with for rent signs, to a piece of ground that I had been told a widow's property manager was willing to rent at below market to a reliable tenant." She paused. "I also drove past a 240-acre property with empty fields and good fence lines, where a man everyone in Pueblo seemed to know about had not planted a single thing for himself in years. And I thought about that the whole drive, and I stopped at the store in Hargrove, and I bought corn and beans and squash seeds and sunflower seeds, and I did not buy too many, and I have not been sorry about any of it." The last of the light was going red and gold over the mesa. "That resembles what you are feeling," he said. "It is exactly what you are feeling," she said, "and it has been from approximately the second Thursday." He did something then that surprised him. He reached out and took her hand. Just her hand, not more than that. Just covered it with his the way you hold something you are careful with. And she turned her hand under his and held on. and they stood there in the warm evening at the edge of his growing field and let the day finish around them. He courted her properly through August and September, which in the practical terms of the territory meant that he came to her place every Thursday as he had, and she came to supper at his place on Sundays, and they rode out twice to look at the land together, and once they rode to Pueblo for supplies, and he took her to the hotel dining room for dinner, which was an event that required both of them to wear their best clothes, and which was the occasion on which she laughed at something he said in the way that Clara had once laughed at him, the unguarded full-body laugh of genuine delight, and he felt it, and it did not hurt the way he had feared it might. It felt instead like an acknowledgment, like Clara would have approved of this woman, like the things he had loved in one life were not canceled by loving in another. He visited her grave on a Sunday morning in September, something he did every few weeks. He stood there in the quiet of the small Crest Hollow cemetery under the cottonwood trees and said what he had to say, which was private, but which included an introduction of sorts, the same way you might write a letter to someone who cannot write back but who you trust to understand. He asked Mary to marry him on an evening in late September, 3 weeks before the harvest, with the corn standing fully ripe and his south field golden and her east corner field just as gold in the autumn light. He did not have a ring immediately, which he apologized for. She told him not to be ridiculous. "Yes," she said. "Of course, yes." And then she said, "I need you to understand something. Thomas was my husband, and I loved him in the way you love the first person who sees you clearly. But I was married for 11 days before he died, and I have spent 3 years since becoming a person I am proud of, and I am not marrying you to be taken care of or to have a roof. I am marrying you because you are the most honest person I have ever met, and because I am in love with you, and because when I think about planting corn next spring, I want to do it on land that is mine and yours both. That is exactly the reason I want to marry you," he said. She put her hands on either side of his face and kissed him then, in the September evening with the corn and the sunflowers and the whole breathing world around them. And it was not a tentative kiss. It was the kiss of someone who had made a deliberate decision and was not second-guessing it. And he held her, and she held him, and Governor, bless him, was mercifully asleep somewhere and not watching. They married on the first Saturday of November, 1878. Pastor Whitmore performed the ceremony in the little church that doubled as a school, and the whole of Crest Hollow came, all 17 families, because in a community this small a wedding was something that belonged to everyone. Earl Giddings brought a cake that was better than anyone expected, which was a kindness. The alderman boys and their wives filled the first 2 pews. Some of the families Mary had only met briefly in the past months came too, because they had been watching this particular story unfold all summer and felt they had a stake in how it came out. Mary wore a dress she had made herself from a blue calico she had ordered from Pueblo, the same blue as the quilt on her chair, the one Roscoe had noticed the first time he came inside her house. She wore her hair down and then up, changed her mind 3 times, and ultimately compromised with it half down, and she looked like someone who was exactly where she was supposed to be. Roscoe wore the good coat he had not put on since he could not remember when, and Hattie Alderman had pressed it for him the day before, and told him without any softening that he looked like a man who had come back to life, which was the kind of thing Hattie Alderman said because she was 81 years old and had earned the right to say whatever she wanted. They stood in front of Pastor Whitmore and made their promises to each other, the old words that had been said in 10,000 frontier churches and 1,000 years of churches before that. And the words were true between them in the particular way that things are true when you have chosen them slowly and with full knowledge of the cost. He put a ring on her finger. He had ridden to Pueblo 10 days after asking her, and come home with a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone set in it, because turquoise was what they had in the jewelry shop, and also because the color reminded him of the sky over the mesa, which was the sky that had been above them when he said what he had to say, and she said what she had to say back. She wore it and she looked at it on her hand with an expression that was quiet and full, and he thought, this is what it looks like when someone feels themselves belonging somewhere. They had the party in Earl Gidding's store because it was the largest indoor space in Crest Hollow, and someone produced a fiddle, and someone else produced a second fiddle, and there was dancing that went on until 9 o'clock, which was practically the middle of the night by territory standards. Roscoe danced twice, which was 2 more times than he had danced in 6 years. Mary danced considerably more than twice, and she was good at it. The kind of dancer who makes you feel competent even if you are not, which was a quality she apparently applied broadly to her life. They drove home together in the wagon under a November sky scattered with stars so bright they seemed to pulse, and she sat beside him with her shoulder against his and her hand in his on the reins, and the mule and Patch walked in companionable silence, and it was cold but not bitterly so, and the Milky Way was laid out overhead like someone had thrown sugar, and Roscoe thought, this is mine. All of this. This moment, this woman, this road home. This is mine, and I did not know I was still going to get something like this. What are you thinking? She asked, her breath making a small cloud in the cold air. That I am lucky, he said. She looked up at the sky. We both are, she said. She squeezed his hand. I was so afraid of this, she added more quietly, of marrying me, of wanting it this much, she said. When you want something this much you are afraid of losing it. I have lost things. I know, he said. So have I. She was quiet for a moment. But we are still here, she said. We are still here, he said. They moved her things to his house over the first week of November. It was not a one-day job, because she had more than she looked like she would have. The accumulation of a woman who had rebuilt her life twice and knew what was worth keeping. The blue and yellow quilt went over the chair in the front room and then, by mutual and unspoken agreement, moved to the bedroom. The jar of dried wildflowers went on the kitchen table. Her good cast-iron pots joined his, and there were suddenly more pots than a single man needed, which felt like abundance. She brought her seedlings too, the ones she had been wintering over in the house, little pots of herbs lined up in paper. Rosemary, sage, thyme. She set them on the kitchen windowsill where they would get the morning light, and the kitchen smelled like something that was specifically alive. He gave her the east room, the one that had been empty, for whatever she needed it to be. She turned it into a combination workroom and seed storage space, and within a week it was organized in a way that suggested a mind with strong opinions about where things should live. He went in once to ask her something, and stood in the doorway looking at the neat rows of labeled seed envelopes and the organized tools, and the maps she had pinned to the wall, detailed hand-drawn maps of both their properties showing soil types and drainage and sun exposure. And he thought, she has been planning this for a while. You mapped the land, he said. She turned from what she was doing. In July, she said, I do not plan things I have not mapped. In July, he repeated. She pointed to a spot on the map where the east parcel and the south field met. This border strip has the best combination of drainage and sun exposure on either property, she said. Tomatoes would do extraordinary things there. You were planning tomatoes in July, he said. I was planning a great many things in July, she said, with a small, wry smile. He shook his head and went back to what he had been doing, and what he had been doing was smiling at the wall for a minute before he got himself together. The harvest came in that fall, and it was not a miraculous harvest, because the drought had taken something out of the season, but it was real and solid, and it was enough. The corn yielded respectably. The beans had done very well. The squash had done almost too well, and they gave a good deal of it away, and Mary made preserves from the rest. The sunflowers he cut and bound into bundles that she hung along the kitchen wall to dry, and all winter the kitchen had that good yellow presence at the top of the walls. December and January were hard in the way that Colorado winters are hard, which is to say beautiful and punishing in equal measure. There were weeks when they did not go into town, because the road was drifted over, and there was no reason to. They kept inside and kept each other company and discovered the small arithmetics of living together. Who got up first? Him. Who took longer to do anything? Her, because she was thorough. Who talked more in the morning? Her, and more in the evening? Him. Whose tolerance for governors sleeping on the floor beside the bed was higher? Hers, considerably. And who made the better biscuits? Him. By a narrow margin, she acknowledged grudgingly once and then never again. They read in the evenings. He had more books than she had expected, a mix of practical agricultural texts and a collection of history and a surprising number of novels. She had her own books, and they traded, and they read aloud to each other on the longer evenings, taking turns, which was something he had not done with anyone since his mother, and which turned out to be one of the best things about being married to a person who was also a reader. He watched her become part of his house, the way a new plant becomes part of an established garden, not forcing itself, not displacing what is already there, just finding the places where it fits and taking hold and growing, and eventually you cannot imagine the garden without it. They talked about Clara sometimes, not often and not painfully, but honestly. He had put her curtains back up in the bedroom, the ones he had folded and put in the cedar chest, because he had asked Mary what she thought, and she had said she thought Clara's curtains sounded like they belonged in the room where Clara had lived, and that she was not a woman who was frightened by her husband having loved someone before her. He loved her more for that than he could quite say. She talked about Thomas sometimes too, the 11 days of a marriage that had ended before it began, and what it felt like to arrive somewhere you had been traveling toward, and find the reason for the journey gone. He listened the way she listened to him, fully, without rushing to comfort, just being there with her in it. February came and they started the seed planting. This was, Roscoe discovered, Mary's church. Her whole self lit up when she was planning a season. She spread her maps on the kitchen table, and she had lists and she had ideas, and she cross-referenced what had done well the previous year against what she wanted to try new, and she argued passionately for things he was skeptical about, and occasionally she was wrong about the arguing, and occasionally she was right, and either way the planning was more interesting than it had any right to be. She wanted to try a small cotton crop on the south end of the east parcel. "This is not cotton country," he said. "The altitude is too high, I know," she said. "But the slope there creates a microclimate. It runs warmer than the rest of the field by at least a few degrees. I measured it in October." He stared at her. "You measured the temperature differential by slope exposure." "I am not reckless," she said. "I am experimental. There is a difference." They argued about it for a week. They tried a small test plot of the cotton, 2 rows, against his better judgment. It grew. It did not thrive, but it grew, and she spent 3 weeks at the end of summer looking at it with the expression of someone making notes for next year. "It needs sandier soil than we have here," she said. "I know," he said. "You do not have to say it like that," she said. "I am saying it like nothing," he said. "I am agreeing with you. You are agreeing with a specific vocal quality that suggests prior knowledge," she said. "I had prior knowledge," he said. "You could have just said so." "You would not have believed me," he said. "You had to see it yourself." She threw a dish towel at him. He caught it. She laughed, and then he laughed, and Governor looked up from his spot by the fire with the mild interest of an old dog watching people enjoy themselves. Governor died in April of 1879, in his sleep, on the rug by the kitchen door, which was where he had spent most of his happiest hours. He was 15 years old, which was a long life for a dog, and he had been in such gradual decline that his dying was more like a very slow sunset than a sudden darkness. Roscoe buried him under the cottonwood tree at the east fence line, and Mary stood with him and said a few genuine words about Governor's character, which had been impeccable. Roscoe stood there after and felt the grief of it, small and clean and specific, the kind of grief that does not threaten to undo you but that you honor because the dog was good and the years were real. "You had him a long time," Mary said. 11 years, he said. "Clara got him as a puppy." She took his hand and they stood there for a moment in the April morning. "Do you want another dog?" she asked. "Not yet. When you're ready." "When I'm ready," he said. 3 weeks later, she came home from town with a puppy in her coat pocket, a small mixed-breed thing with enormous paws and no dignity, and she set it on the kitchen floor, and it immediately fell down and looked confused. "You said when I was ready," he said. "You looked ready," she said. The puppy's name became Colonel, which was Governor's natural successor in the chain of command, and he was the most ridiculous animal Roscoe had ever encountered, and he was absolutely besotted with Mary, which Roscoe thought showed excellent taste. The second planting season was better than the first. They had 2 full 100 acres under cultivation between the two properties, organized now according to Mary's soil maps and Roscoe's knowledge of the land's temperament. They hired 2 hands for the heavy work, brothers named Ed and Frank Tolliver from the edge of the Crest Hollow community, good workers who had been between situations since the Holt property sold. The Tollivers worked hard and asked few questions, and the 4 of them fell into a good rhythm, the kind that makes a place feel like it is running as it should. In June, Mary told him she was pregnant. She told him at breakfast. She said it simply, looking at him over her coffee cup with the steady gaze she brought to important statements, and then she waited. He sat very still for a moment. He thought about William, the 3 days of William's life and the aftermath of it. He thought about the specific particular pain of that, the loss that had been so layered and complex, because it was all losses at once. He had not let himself think very much about the possibility of children again, because thinking about it required hoping, and hoping had cost him considerably. But he was looking at Mary, who was watching him with a face that was open and careful both, who understood without his having to explain why this moment was complicated, who was waiting with that full patience of hers, not requiring him to perform happiness he had not yet reached. He reached across the table and took her hand. "Are you all right?" he said. "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "I feel strong. The doc in Pueblo saw me last week when I was in for supplies. He says everything is as it should be." He squeezed her hand. He felt the happiness arriving, not all at once but in the gradual way of sunlight coming into a cold room, filling the corners. "You went to Pueblo without telling me," he said. "I wanted to be sure before I said anything," she said, "in case it was nothing. I did not want to." She stopped. She understood about William without him having explained every part of it. "I wanted to be sure first." "Thank you for that," he said. "How are you feeling?" she asked. He looked at their joined hands on the kitchen table, the turquoise ring and his own rough hand, the morning coming through the herbs on the windowsill and the smell of coffee, and the whole impossible ordinary beauty of it. "I am feeling like the luckiest man in Colorado territory," he said, and meant it with every part of himself. She came around the table and he stood up and she put her arms around him, and he held her tight, carefully, the way you hold things that are precious and also strong. And outside the window the June morning was blazing gold, and the fields were green, and Colonel was barking at something in the barn that had probably been there for years, and was not a threat to anyone. The pregnancy was not easy in the heat of summer. July and August were brutal, and she was tired in a way she refused to make very much of. But he watched her, and tried to take on more of the physical work without making it obvious he was doing so, which she saw through completely but allowed because she was practical. He drove her to Pueblo twice in the fall to see the doctor, and both times the doctor said all was well, and both times Roscoe sat in the waiting area of the doctor's small office, gripping his hat in both hands and doing arithmetic in his head to keep his mind occupied. Their son was born on a Wednesday in November of 1879, 12 months after their wedding, as if he had taken the full year to get everything in order before arriving. He was born in the farmhouse with a midwife named Mrs. Cordova from the neighboring property, and the doctor from Pueblo who had ridden out when the labor proved long. He was born healthy and loud, with strong lungs that announced his presence with an authority that seemed excessive for something that small. Mary lay in the bed afterward with the baby in her arms and looked at him with the particular expression that Roscoe had no prior frame of reference for, the expression of a woman looking at her child for the first time. He sat beside her on the edge of the bed and looked at both of them. "He is healthy," the doctor said from the doorway. "Strong baby." "You did well, Mrs. Hudson." Mary was not looking at the doctor. She was looking at the baby, and then she looked at Roscoe, and her eyes were wet and bright, and she was smiling in a way that was so open it was almost hard to look at, the way some things are almost too bright. "What do we call him?" she said. They had talked about names. They had not agreed. He had mentioned James after his father. She had mentioned Charles. They had talked about other names without landing anywhere. He looked at the baby, red-faced and furious and perfect. "Samuel," he said. He did not know until he said it that he was going to say it. It was not a name they had discussed, but it was the right one. He knew it the way he knew good soil. "Samuel James Hudson." She looked at him. "Samuel James," she said, trying it. She looked back at the baby. "Hello, Samuel James." The baby stopped making noise for approximately 10 seconds as if considering the name, and then resumed. "He has opinions," Mary said. "He is going to be exhausting," Roscoe said, and the love in his voice when he said it was so evident that Mary laughed and then winced and told him not to make her laugh for at least 3 days. Samuel James Hudson grew. He grew the way crops grow when everything is right, steadily, and with the occasional dramatic lurch that meant you measured him in the doorframe and could not quite believe the numbers. He was a loud, happy, opinionated baby who became a loud, happy, opinionated toddler, and he had his mother's eyes, the dark ones with the light in them, and his father's hands, wide and capable, and he learned to walk by pulling himself up on the lowest fence rail, and he learned to talk by apparently deciding one afternoon to simply begin doing it. The land was producing well. The years from 1879 forward were better weather years, the drought breaking and the rains coming in a pattern that a farmer could work with. The east parcel that Roscoe transferred to joint ownership in 1880, with proper paperwork from the Pueblo courthouse that took most of a day and a lot of ink, but that was done right, produced a corn yield in 1880 that was the best in the county. Mary's soil maps, which Ed and Frank Tolliver had initially regarded with polite skepticism, turned out to be so accurate that the Alderman family eventually asked if she would do one for their land too, and she did, and they paid her for it, which led to 2 other families in the area making the same request. She was becoming known in the territory for knowing land. There was a satisfaction to watching this happen that Roscoe could not quite quantify, the particular pleasure of watching someone be properly recognized for what they were actually extraordinary at. Prentice attempted one more approach in 1880, this time through a lawyer's letter rather than personal visit. Roscoe's response, written with the help of the Pueblo solicitor he had first consulted in 1878, was thorough and final, and the lawyer's letter was not answered with another. The water rights matter was eventually resolved through the Territorial Land Office in a way that confirmed the Hudson's claim on the creek line through the north corner. The resolution, when it came, was not dramatic. It was a piece of paper that said what was true, and Roscoe put it in the cedar chest next to Clara's curtains and the deed to the east parcel, which was where he kept the things that mattered. Samuel was 2.5 when Mary told Roscoe she was pregnant again. This time she told him at supper, while Samuel was attempting to stack biscuits into a tower. There was no careful waiting, no quiet over the coffee cups. She just said it in the warm, ordinary light of the kitchen, and Roscoe looked at her and felt the happiness as a clean, uncomplicated thing, not shadowed, not careful, just real. "When?" he said. "July, the doctor thinks," she said. "Late July. Summer," he said. "Yes," she said, "which I am less than delighted about." "You managed last time," he said. "I managed," she said. "Managing is not the same as enjoying." Samuel toppled his biscuit tower and looked at the wreckage with philosophical calm. The second child was a girl, born on a Saturday in late July 1881, who arrived faster and with less drama than Samuel had, as if she had learned from his example and decided to improve on the process. She was smaller than Samuel had been and quieter, The kind of quiet that is not emptiness but containment, the kind that usually means a great deal going on inside. They named her Clara. Roscoe had thought about it for months, had not said anything to Mary, and had not been sure he would say anything. On the second day, when Mary was rested and the baby was sleeping and Samuel was being minded by Mrs. Cordova in the other room, he said it. "I have been thinking about the name," he said. "Tell me," she said. "Clara," he said. "If you are willing. If it does not, I know it is not a simple name to offer." Mary looked at the baby, at the small sleeping face, and then she looked at him with those dark eyes that were so clear he always felt seen straight through when they were on him. "It is not a simple name," she said, "but it is a good one." And I think she paused, finding the words. "I think the women we carry with us deserve to have their names spoken into the world, not just kept inside. It seems right to me." He had to look away for a moment at the window at the summer light. "Clara Rose Hudson," Mary said, and the name went into the room and settled there, both weight and release at once. "Clara Rose," he said. They brought the children home, all of them, and the house that had been quiet for so long was not quiet anymore. Samuel ran through it at all hours pursuing Colonel, and being pursued by Colonel with equal enthusiasm, and no clear purpose. Clara observed all of this from wherever she happened to be placed, with the focused attention of someone taking notes. The kitchen smelled perpetually of something good, because Mary was always cooking or preserving or doing something to produce that warm smell that Roscoe had come to understand as the smell of the life they had built. He planted again every spring. He planted for himself, for his family, for this life that had come back to him in the form of a woman at a fence with a sack of seeds she said were extra. In the fall of 1882, when Samuel was nearly 3 and Clara was 13 months, and pulling herself around the furniture with determination, Roscoe walked out to the south field in the early morning before the rest of the house was awake. The corn was in, the harvest done for the season, and the field was resting in the amber October light. He stood at the edge of it and looked at the length of it, the way it ran south to the fence line where the sunflowers had been, where the sunflowers still came back every year from the seeds that had dropped. He thought about the morning in April of 1878 when he had seen a woman at this fence for the first time. He thought about the sack of seeds and the knowledge that they were not extra. He thought about everything that had followed from that single deliberate act of kindness from a woman who had assessed a situation, and decided that what it needed was not pity or words, but the most specific, practical, generous thing she could think of. He thought about the way the land had opened up under the plow that first week, the way it had felt to put seeds in the ground after 6 years of letting it lie empty. He thought about Mary saying, the person who needed planting again was not the field. She had been right about that. She was right about a great many things, and he had stopped being surprised by this and had started being grateful for it. He heard the house door and turned. She was coming across the yard with 2 cups of coffee, her boots on, her hair loose in the morning the way she wore it before the day's work required it to be up, and Clara on her hip because Clara had lately decided that being put down was unacceptable until a respectable hour. Samuel was presumably still asleep, which was unusual enough to be a gift. She came and stood beside him and handed him a cup. "Thinking," she said. "Remembering," he said. She looked at the field, at the morning light on the stubble, the sunflower stalks bent at the fence line, the sky going from dark blue to pale gold above the mesa. Clara reached for Roscoe's cup with the confident entitlement of a 13-month-old, and he redirected her hand to his shoulder and she settled for that. "Good remembering or hard remembering?" Mary asked. "Good," he said. "Just good." She leaned against his arm and he put his free arm around her, and Clara reached up and touched his face with a small exploring hand the way babies do, discovering the geography of it. He turned and pressed his lips briefly to the top of her head, that daughter named for a woman who had also loved this land, and the morning came on around all of them, gold and cold and clear. "I want to try the south corner for rye next year," Mary said, sipping her coffee. "The drainage is wrong for rye," he said. "The drainage is improvable," she said. "I have a plan for it." "Of course you do," he said. "I mapped it last week," she said. "Of course you did," he said. She laughed, that full laugh, and Clara startled and then laughed too, imitating her mother with pure delight. And across the yard, Colonel began to bark at something in the barn that was definitely not a threat to anyone. Roscoe Hudson stood in his field on an October morning in 1882 with his wife against his side and his daughter in his arms, and the sound of laughter in the October air. And the land stretched out around him full and quiet. The land he had stopped planting and started planting again. The land that had come back to life because a woman had stood at its fence and decided, for reasons she had kept to herself until he was ready to hear them, that what it needed was seeds. He thought, this is the whole of it. This is everything you can ask for. The work and the land and the people and the mourning and the laughing and the coffee and the impossible, persistent, stubborn fact of being alive and in love on the earth. He had not planted anything for himself in 6 years. He would plant everything from now on. The rye, when they tried it the following spring, did not work in the south corner. Mary's drainage improvements helped, but not enough, and the stalks came up spindly and the yield was disappointing, and she stood looking at it in August with an expression that was calculating rather than defeated. "I was partly right," she said. "Partly," he agreed. "The drainage plan worked," she said. "The soil chemistry is the remaining issue." "I can address that." "I know you can," he said, and meant it completely. She looked at him sideways. "You are not going to say anything about the rye." "I am going to say nothing about the rye," he said. "You have an opinion about the rye. I have noted the rye and I am keeping my note to myself." She shook her head, but she was smiling. "Next year I will get it right." "Next year you will get it right," he said. She did get it right. The year after that, the south corner rye was the best stand of grain on the property, and she stood looking at it in August of 1884 with Samuel at her side and Clara on Roscoe's shoulders, pointing at things and making demands, and she had the expression of a person whose patience has been completely vindicated. She did not say anything. He did not say anything either. After a moment she reached over and took his hand. "Thank you," she said, which was not about the rye. "Thank you," he said back, which was not about the rye either. Samuel looked up at both of them with the frank incomprehension of a 5-year-old confronted with adult emotion. "What for?" he said. "Everything," Roscoe said. Samuel accepted this with the philosophical calm he had been applying to baffling situations since the Biscuit Tower incident. Clara pulled at Roscoe's hair from above and announced that she wanted to see the horses. They walked back across the field toward the barn, the 4 of them, through the late afternoon light that lay golden and warm over everything. The corn and the rye and the squash and the sunflowers along the fence line, the whole growing living abundance of it, and the cottonwood by the east fence was going yellow in the August heat, and the house stood square and solid with the light in the windows, and they went home together, all 4 of them, into the ordinary, extraordinary life they had planted and tended and grown. Inside the kitchen the herbs were on the windowsill, and the coffee pot was on the stove, and Clara's curtains were in the bedroom window where they had always belonged, and Mary's quilt was on the chair, and on the table where they ate their meals there was a small jar of dried sunflowers that Mary refreshed every fall from the fence-line blooms, the same fence line where the first seeds had gone in 6 years after they should have, planted by a man who had finally been given a reason again. The evening came in slow and warm, and supper was made and eaten with the full cheerful chaos of children at a table, and afterward they sat on the porch in the cooling air, and the stars came out over the mesa one by one, the way they always did, unhurried, and Samuel fell asleep in his father's lap, and Clara sat solemnly in her mother's arms watching the fireflies above the field, and the night was quiet and full of cricket sound, and the whole world was, for this moment, exactly as it should be. Roscoe looked at Mary over the heads of their sleeping and waking children, and she looked back at him, and neither of them needed to say anything because everything had already been said and planted and grown up out of the ground between them, rooted deep, reaching toward the same light. This was the life. This was what the seeds had been for. Not the corn, not the rye, not the squash or the beans or the sunflowers along the fence, though those too, all of those too. But this, the two of them on a porch in the Colorado evening, having chosen each other with full knowledge and full honesty, having built something out of empty ground and extra seeds, and the deliberate stubborn act of planting in soil that had been fallow too long. It had not been easy. Nothing true ever was. But it had been worth every day of the working, and they both knew it, and knowing it was enough, and more than enough, and everything.